In this episode, we are telling the story of the 596 LCG, AEC Renown, and the September running day from the Friends of King Alfred buses.
So the sun is shining here at St Catherine's, and we've managed to assemble our fleet, such as we've managed to bring today, all along behind me. And we have from left to right the oldest vehicles at this end and the bigger and more modern ones at the other end, but the coaches bringing up the rear at the back. Everything that runs is here today. It's an opportunity to get our fleet in a line. So the whole collection is here for people to walk up and down, have a look at, and we only do this once a year. In fact, this is only really the second time we've done it here at St Catherine's. We did it last year, and now we're here today, 15th of September, with the sun shining, and looks like it's going to be warm all day long. So when we get the buses up to the Broadway at 11 o'clock and start to operate, we should be having a lovely day. So now it's a question of enjoying the display, and hopefully a few people will buy programs, because remembering that our programs for sale today at £6 each are how we fund all of this, and later on riding the fleet across the network. Hopefully we'll have a great day.
Everybody, right, thank you.
Yes, well, hello. We've just come off a King Alfred's Heritage bus, and I'm from Winchester Poetry Festival. My name's Jane Bryant, and I'm the Chair of Trustees of Winchester Poetry Festival. And we've had this wonderful partnership between King Alfred's buses, Winchester Poetry Festival and Heritage Open Days in Winchester. And we've had 5 poets on a bus enjoying a journey to Crawley and back again, all under the theme of networks, connections and roots. And the 5 poets took us on different emotional and word journeys while we went on the wonderful Heritage bus. Looking at the audience, everybody had a great time. There were poems that made us smile, poems that made us laugh, poems that made us think and reflect on all sorts of things as we were on our wonderful journey.
So here we are in Winchester. It's the end of the day. It's something like 5:30, and this is the last vehicle left in the Broadway, our Bedford VAL. And I'm just about to get into it and take it back to our base at Romsey. We've had the full operation out there today. The sun's been shining, and yet it hasn't been too hot. So it's been really quite a comfortable day for our operation. We've carried quite a lot of people. A happy time has been had by most, I think. You never quite know what's going on out there, so we'll get some feedback later, no doubt. From where I've been, which is here in Winchester Broadway, beside King Alfred's statue, it's been running reasonably well. We're going to bed now because we jolly well need it.
Hello from your video producer here. This time in the September running day, other than just holding my camera trying to make a video, I was actually acting as a conductor for most of the afternoon on the 596 LCG. While I had the ticket machine failure, my set-right ticket machine had a paper jam I couldn't resolve. I did try to tell the story of this bus to all the passengers on board. We did the video for the AEC Renown back in 2022, but I couldn't remember much of it. Had to quickly read through this board downstairs to remind myself its story. When the bus came back to the Broadway in Winchester, there was a young gentleman traveling with his parents. He told me this was the best bus journey he ever had. Thank you for your encouragement, young gentleman. You have been very kind. On the way home after the running day, I think the 596 LCG deserves its own video for its remarkable story. To tell us all about it, here's James.
Well, hello again, and our star of the show today is an AEC Renown, one of two in the Friends of King Alfred buses collection, 596 LCG. Now these days we present it in National Bus Company poppy red livery, which is what it carried from 1973 till about 1977 when it left Winchester. It of course started in 1964 in King Alfred's green and cream livery. One of two AEC vehicles. It ran in the traditional livery with dark green on the lower panels and a slightly lighter green above, whereas 595 got repainted during its time with King Alfred and is in the later livery with the same colour green on both parts of the vehicle. Both buses ran right the way through till the 28th of April 1973, and then this bus was the first King Alfred bus to go away to Hants Dorset's workshops in Southampton and be repainted and represented as a Hants Dorset bus. And at the time, having Hants Dorset buses red was quite a revolution in itself, because the red colour scheme replaced green as the Hants Dorset livery only in the year before, in 1972. That little thing up there, RP, that shows it was painted last in May 1976.
Hello, it's your video producer again. I wonder who painted this bus back in 1976 and wrote this message inside. Does it mean repainted, partially varnished in May 1976? Or something else? Could you decode this message for me, please? If you can decode this message, please write down your interpretation in the comments below. Back to James.
Astonishingly, in a way, this bus looked, as it looks now, really quite smart in its bright poppy red livery. Now, the paint didn't last very well and it tended to fade, but in fact this bus was repainted red again towards the end of its life in Winchester, so it always did look actually pretty smart. Back in 1977, this bus wasn't the most reliable and was quite a pain to Hants Dorset. And in the end, they took it out of service because of engine problems, but it didn't prevent them from repainting it. So it looked sparkly and shiny when it went into the disposal line. And an American gentleman called Ralph Webb, who was setting up a business in Washington, D.C. called Spirit of 76 Tours Incorporated. He was looking for British buses to take back to the USA to operate tours and trips around the nation's capital. He was attracted to this bus because it was lovely and shiny, and so he bought it, and no one bothered to tell him that it wasn't necessarily the best buy in the book. And off it went to America. No more was heard of it, and that was in 1977. This bus had disappeared completely. Fast forward 10 years, and in the meantime, Graham Wareham, who was then involved with the Oxford Bus Museum, had come across the twin of this, 595 LCG, working for Burma Castrol on Merseyside, and he'd negotiated to buy that. And he organised upgrading and reconstruction and repaint back into King Alfred livery. And so there was a King Alfred AEC Renown in captivity, if you see what I mean. How does it come about that we ended up with two? There were only two and we've got them both. It's a strange tale. Now the fact is that we came across this bus quite by accident, and it was the result of a different repatriation story, that of our 1956 Leyland Titan 494. Suffice it to say for this episode that on the way back from my first visit to Augusta, Georgia, to look at 494, we had a bit of time spare. We had a day spare, and someone had said there is a King Alfred Renown somewhere in the Washington area. So we did a bit of detective work, and astonishingly, in a place called New Carrollton in Maryland, which is just adjacent to Washington DC, we looked over a fence and there was an advert for Hancock's Winchester radio and TV. We were looking at a King Alfred bus, and then we looked a bit harder and we found ourselves looking at a yard full of British buses. It had Bristol Lodekkas, a couple of Dennis Lowlines from Aldershot. It had about 25 low-height double-deckers. And in the corner was this vehicle, looking very sorry for itself. It only had one wheel. It had been sitting in the heat for 11 years. The seats had all molded away to nothing. Most of the glass was missing. It looked a sad case. The paint was peeling. And as we were staring at it, the owner of the site, Ralph Webb, swept in a Vanden Plas Princess limousine with one wing missing and a big wheel inside where you might have had the Duchess of Whatnot sitting in the back of it. Oh, he says, are you interested in our bus? And one thing led to another. And in the end, he said, well, you can have our bus as a gift. I remember thinking, well, that's all very nice, but it's only got one wheel. It's in Washington, and we've got another one in captivity, as I said. So we said, well, thank you, but we'll think about it. A year later, I found myself in New Orleans doing something for business with a half an hour, well, afternoon actually, with nothing to do. And out of idle curiosity, I rang the guy up. Ralph, I said, it's James Freeman. He said, oh, he said, well, I've gone out of business. I've gone bankrupt, in fact, and that yard has been cleared, all bar the Duchess. They used to call it the Duchess because it was unreliable. And anyway, he said, it's still standing there. If you put on your best accent and speak to the guy who's bought the site, he just might let you keep it. And furthermore, if you were to wire me the money, I will fix it to find some wheels and get the vehicle transported, towed to a port of your choice. Baltimore is the place. I always say to people, would you wire, it turned out to be $1,800 to a known bankrupt in a foreign country? Well, I'm not sure you would, but we did, and he was as good as his word. And the bus was pulled out of its corner, put on some wheels, and towed to Baltimore so that we could then fix up to bring it back across the Atlantic. Not a straightforward thing, I have to say. In the Southampton Yellow Pages, that's a thing from the past, there were 44 freight forwarders. We telephoned 43 of them, all said, oh no, we can't bring a double-decker bus back from America. No, quite out of the question. The 44th, a company called Pell Agencies of Canute Road, said, oh yeah, that's straightforward enough. 3,000 quid, we'll do it for you. We arranged for the vehicle to be brought back across the Atlantic on a boat called the Nozac Ranger from Baltimore to Sheerness. And we went to Sheerness, and picked up the vehicle. We had a tow bus that we borrowed from Provincial Bus Company, and we towed it back to Winchester. And that was in September 1988. And it was in a poor state, but we set ourselves the task of getting it ready for presentation at the running day on the 1st of January 1989. And would you believe, it was there. It was painted green, it was everything except it wasn't taxed and it wasn't MOT'd. So it was on display on the 1st of January in full King Alfred regalia, looking absolutely splendid and running. We subsequently MOT'd it, and it was taxed, and it was relaunched at the Watercress line, in fact, in the spring of 1989. It joined with the launch of an S160 American locomotive at Alfred Station. And so our King Alfred bus was greeted by 2 American Army officers, and we were delighted by that. So we owned 596, and remember 595, its twin, was at the Oxford Bus Museum. It was the first time that they were brought together was at a rally in Bristol, strangely enough. They stood side by side, and we realised the value of having twin sets of buses. And in fact, if you look at the King Alfred collection, we have several sets of twins: Panthers, Renowns, Atlantines, to name but 3. So let's have a look at our AEC Renown, because it has a few features which are worth paying attention to. So straight away we can see it's a nicely proportioned vehicle, has a big radiator grille with the AEC triangle in the middle of it, so there's no doubt who built it. The engine is here under the canopy, an AEC AV590, an engine which is common to the Routemaster. People often talk about Routemasters, so this is the same engine as the Routemaster. And in fact, this bus has the same gearbox as the Routemaster, albeit controlled in a slightly different way. These buses were very unusual in that they had a sliding door for the cab. Very practical, actually, because in a confined space, you haven't got a flapping door. You can just move this back and then clamber in. Inside, the thing about these buses that differentiated them from the AEC Bridgemasters that came before is that they had semi-automatic transmission, so only 2 pedals, throttle and brake. We come round and we look at the body. Built by Park Royal, very much connected with AEC and often used to body AECs. But this is not a chassis-less vehicle. It has a separate chassis and a traditional body on it. You can see it's a good low height design, 13'6" the total. Now the AEC Renown was a low height double-decker, and the thing about double-deck buses in Britain is that the traditional design, what you might see on a London Routemaster, was what was called a high-bridge bus. It was 14'6" high, and that meant that in both decks you had a centre gangway and a reasonable amount of headroom. Never worried me, of course, because I'm short, but for taller people that's quite an issue. In this part of the world, in Hampshire, the railway bridges, the London South Western Railway tended to build rather low bridges, meant that the traditional high-bridge bus was of less use than what was called low-bridge design. Now, in order to gain a foot less height, the upper deck of the double-decker bus was compressed by putting all the seats on one side in rows of 4 and having a low gangway on the right-hand side. That was really quite awkward, tricky to get in and out of the seats, uncomfortable for the conductors collecting the money, and the pickpockets' paradise. And downstairs, although it looked on first sight just like a high-bridge bus, if you sat on the right-hand side and got up suddenly, you'd hit your head on the sunken gangway. Our bus 494 models that approach. So the low-bridge bus was by no means satisfactory, really, and the high-bridge bus simply couldn't be used on quite a lot of King Alfred's routes. about 1949, when the Bristol Tramways and Carriage Company invented a thing called the Bristol Lodekka. And the feature that really mattered about the Lodekka was that the back axle was called drop centre rear axle. So the axle, as it were, went down and then came up again at the other side. So the wheel centres were higher than the actual axle, and the differential was offset. And what that meant was that you could have a really low floor on the lower deck, and so you could have the same arrangement as a high-bridge bus with centre gangways, quite comfortable, but within a bus that was only 13'6" high. Brilliant idea, but the only snag for people like the Chisnells, who ran the King Alfred Motor Services, was that they were independent, and Bristol vehicles were only accessible to state-owned companies, the local one being Hants Dorset, of course. So while Hants Dorset during the 1950s built up a fleet of Bristol Lodekkas, King Alfred didn't have access to that. So right up to 1956, they were still buying low bridge buses like our 494. But in due course, other manufacturers came up with similar sorts of ideas, and AEC appeared with the Bridgemaster. Now, King Alfred bought two Bridgemasters in 1959. They were pretty revolutionary. Big, long double-deckers, 74-seaters, 30 feet long, with low height and therefore centre gangway, both decks. And they were successful enough that they bought a second lot in 1961. But then the Bridgemaster went out of production, various things about it which were unusual. It was a monocoque construction that had to say it had no chassis. And they replaced it with the AEC Renown, which is a conventional chassis, but to the same basic arrangement. Renown was available as a front loader, like the one behind us, or as a rear loader, but King Alfred opted to buy two front-loading AEC Renowns, and they were delivered in 1964. If we come to the entrance, this is where you see the benefit, because inside the bus there is no step. In the days when people really didn't pay attention to access issues, this bus has only just the one step, and if you think about it coming from a pavement, actually that's quite accessible. Oddly, they put a pole in the middle, so there's no question of rolling onto this with a wheelchair, for example, but to step in and out of it was really quite practical. And the engine is slightly on the skew so that the gearbox and the transfer box and everything are underneath the stairs, leaving the space clear for people to circulate at the bottom of the stairs and into the saloon. Just noting as we pass that this has a Hants Dorset fleet number on it, of course, 2212, and the two blobs for Winchester. Winchester was yellow and orange. Southampton was just yellow. So one of the features of the restoration was that the seats were absolutely ruined, and we had to obtain the necessary supplies of the Moquette and have the vehicle completely retrimmed. And that was done in 1988, and you can see that it's lasted extremely well. We're now in 2024, and the look of the thing is still pretty new, really. But one of the features of this bus as constructed, which makes it different from the Bristol Lodekka that we were talking about earlier, is that upstairs, because the staircase is a little bit further back in the vehicle, they've managed to create two rows in the front here, where the Bristol Lodekka only has one. And that helps to give us a 75-seat capacity in this vehicle, so it's a big carrying bus. Anyway, it's all trimmed up and looking the part. One of the problems with these vehicles is that they have a single skin dome. So this is just a fiberglass dome here, right the way back to here, and then a more traditional construction method for the rest. Now, what that means is that this gets a lot of condensation on it, and the Bridgemasters, which had the same arrangement, used to be always all bashed in here where they met the trees. This is still pretty bashed in, actually, because tree damage is a constant problem.
When did NBC form?
Well, it was formed in '69 and the logo and everything appeared in 1972. So here's a National coach, you see. National was the National Bus Company, and when National was formed, what they did was to paint all the coaches white and put National on the side of them, and National Express evolved out of that. The National Wonder Bus.
Oh, they still do the parcel.
Yeah, so it's a big deal. 40 years ago, parcels by bus were a big thing. When I was a conductor, we used to do a tremendous amount of parcels. Now, here's an oddity. King Alfred were well known for replacing windows in their buses with hardboard. One of the things that happened was that the ventilator that was in here, this had broken out, and King Alfred had put in a piece of hardboard in its place. When this went down to Southampton to be repainted, they said to themselves, all bits of hardboard are glass. So they put a window in here. When it came back all painted red, it had a piece, you could see out through this. Quite extraordinary, actually. Most unusual. And it kept that throughout its Hants Dorset career. We've actually painted it over because it is a bit weird. And so if you look at the outside of this, it's red. And from inside, it's I think, some kind of, I don't know what that is, but it's not glass. Anyway, here's our vehicle. And to all intents and purposes, it looks as it did when it ran in service in Winchester. Now, of course, when it was with King Alfred, it was green, and it was only latterly that it was red. And we kept it as a green bus in FoKAB ownership for many years, but it began to look really shabby. True to form, I might say, because the original also began to look really shabby towards the 1970, 71, 72, 73. But for our collection, that was a bit too shabby, and we thought we'd better do something about it. And the job of repainting it was a massive one because it was in quite a poor state. And it was suggested that rather than paint it green, we'd paint it red. We've got a green one already, 595, and this was the very first bus to be painted in National Bus Company Poppy Red. So why not commemorate that by actually painting this red? And it does look remarkably smart. I mean, never mind what would have happened to it as the paint faded at the moment, and in this condition it looks lovely. Anyway, here we are. Today 2212 represents what happened after 28th of April 1973, and it's always very popular. It's popular to photograph, it's popular with the kids because it's red.
I hope you enjoyed this video and learnt about the remarkable story of the 596 LCG. Do you know, since the original introduction video in 2022, we have made another one for the green one, 595 LCG, in the 2024 Bournemouth Bus Rally video. Also, for the POU 494 Leyland Titan, we have made a new one in the 2024 Alton Bus Rally video too. The most popular one is the CCG 704C, Bedford VAL. You can find all the links in the descriptions below. They go straight to the point when the introductions begins. Please do come to join our next running day event on the 1st of January 2025. Come to ride on the vintage King Alfred buses for free to feel how the bus rides were like back in several decades ago. If you see the volunteers wearing the King Alfred uniforms, do say hi to them and tell them how much you appreciate the running days and the King Alfred buses. Oh, if you see me holding a tiny little camera, please feel free to wave and smile and be a part of the video. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.